Hi, this is Nightly Assets, and I'm going to show you the object fader script. Now in this demo scene, I set it up to where the caster is coming from the camera position all the way down to the player, which is probably the most common setup. But the player character in this case and the camera could be any two objects. I can also say have this be the caster and it'll just look through here, and then these two objects right there will be faded. Alright, so let's take a look and see what it does. Pretty straightforward, what you would expect. Now the nice thing about this solution, there are other similar solutions. The nice thing about this one is that it's not editing this material that you see right here, this opaque standard shader material. These are all standard shaders. It's not editing these directly, which means you can use this fading on objects that use an opaque or a cutout, and of course also a fade and a transparent. And let me just quickly show you what's happening here. And let's put it, let's leave it on normal for now. So it starts out with this preset material, the standard shader, and it's going to copy that shader and create a new material, or it creates a new material based off of that shader that can fade, and it slowly fades this in and out. And once it's done, it sets it back to the old material, so you're not going to be constantly increasing your material count. I can actually show you this in the profiler. So the amount of materials that we have right now is 51. As I stamp in front of it, it creates one material, which is a temporary material, so it goes to 52. And once we're out of it, and it goes back to 51. So you're not going to be messing with your memory, luckily. Alright, let's take a look at these settings that we have. So again, I put it on the camera for now. I'm going to skip casting type for now and just talk about the player. The player is, of course, this little guy, and it's going to be looking from the camera to the player. And again, that can be any two kinds of objects. It doesn't have to be a camera player setup. It could be whatever you want. So as you can see, it worked with all standard materials, which is nice. And it is just a plug and play. All you need to do is drag this fade object script onto your camera and it'll just work. Same goes for if you have an object which has multiple materials, and in this case it has all these standards, all the standard materials in there. Let me just show you that. So it has the opaque, a fade, a cutout, and a transparent, and this will also automatically just work. Now here we have a trigger, and it kind of depends on what you want, if you want to fade that out or not. So it doesn't do it by default, but if you just click right here on include triggers, then it will just work on triggers as well. Now we enter this situation, which is kind of like a tunnel. And here we're gonna have to choose a different casting type, because right now it's just a ray cast, which is one line from the camera to the character, and it's not gonna catch everything. And it's still very hard to see what I'm doing here. So we have a couple different casting types. We have sphere, which will definitely solve our problem here. And the sphere is gonna use a radius. Now the problem with the sphere is it's gonna basically cast a sphere from, in this case, the camera view to the player. But that's not exactly what what we want here, because what it's gonna do, especially, like as you can see, the head is still being obstructed. So if I increase the radius, yeah, that does solve it. But if you would take a look at the scene view right here, if I increase my radius too far, it's gonna fade this object, which is really unnecessary. So what would be more appropriate is something like a capsule. And it's basically going to create a capsule in this kind of shape with a radius. And I think 2 is probably okay. That way I can step all the way to the right and still get the left blocks. And a capsule height is gonna be helpful. So that just increases the height of the capsule that it's gonna be sending. So 8's a bit overkill. It's probably not necessary. Something like 2 would be fine. Now, some other settings that we have are the maximum transparency, so we can make it just a very, very subtle type of fade, or have it be gone completely, if that's what you want. And then also the fade speed, you can make it very slow. This is gonna take forever. Yeah, you can't even see it. Let me just pull that up just a little bit. And lower my maximum transparency. So as you can see, this is quite slow. And we can also increase it to 5. Should be really fast. Alright. Then depth tolerance is to prevent some false positives, and that especially happens with spheres and capsules. And let me just set this to sphere so I can show you what that means. And let's just turn depth tolerance off. So what happens if you have a sphere cast? This is now what we want. We're standing right next to it, even if you're yeah. So this is not where you want the object to fade. So what we can do is increase the depth tolerance. And basically what that does is it's going to be checking the distance between, in this case, the camera and the player, and it's going to compare that to the distance between the camera and the object that is being hit. So if we say set it to 2, then it needs to be at least 2 meters closer. The distance between the object and the camera has to be at least 2 meters shorter than the distance between the player and the camera. And so now it doesn't happen where I'm standing right next to it. It doesn't fade anymore. Alright, now lastly, we can also, oh yeah, grouped, right. I should talk about that. Why are some of these fading and others not? Well, it's quite simple. All you have to do is to make an object be fadeable is have the tag can fade. Now I know that tags are kind of sparse. You can't tag one object with multiple tags, so it also looks through all the parent objects. So right here I have these roof cubes, and I just put them in an empty game object. I named it can fade, but you could name it whatever you want. The tag just needs to be can fade. And everything that doesn't have the tag can fade, it just ignores. Now lastly, yes, custom shaders. You can use this with custom shaders, but it does require some setup. So basically what the script does is it's going to copy, by default it's going to copy the shader, or it's going to create a material based off of the shader that the object currently has, which works perfectly for standard materials, standard shaders, but if you have a custom shader, it's going to be a little bit different. So here I have a custom shader that I made, and it's going to need an extra script, which is this fade objects override script. Let's bring that down. It can't go down, right? Oh, right, of course, because that's the material. All right, so it's gonna be looking for an alpha property name, and that's the property of the shader. Now, by default, it's going to use underscore color, which most of the built-in shaders use. But if you create a custom shader, it doesn't automatically create a color property for you. So, and even if it does, it has to be the property that ultimately affects the opacity. So let me just bring this over here. This is the custom shader that I used. And this alpha property, which it's requesting, which it is looking for, is used to is going to be multiplied by the final RGBA. Now, this alpha right here is going to have, in colors, it's going to be 1, 1, 1. It's not going to change anything, right? Multiply something by 1, nothing happens. And this last one is going to be changed through the fade script. Now also, there are two things you can do to make it work with your custom shader. Now one is it's going to create a material based off of a shader, and you can either say, I'm going to drag in a different shader based off of my custom shader. So I could just make a custom shader fade, which is going to have a different blend mode, and put that in there. And it's just going to create that material based off of the shader you put in here, and it's going to copy all the properties from the old shader or from the old material into the new material. Now what you can also do, if you don't want to create a specifically faded shader for every custom shader you have, is you can get these 4 lines, put them in there. So the mode, source blend, the destination blend, and the Z-Write. And this is just set up for it to be opaque. You can find, these are also based off of the properties of the standard shader. So if you want to make it something else, you have to change these settings into something else if that's what you want. So these are just set up. It's not always going to be 1 for you or 0 for you, and then 1, 0, 1. This is just how it's set up for an opaque material. And then you want these 2 lines and usually your first pass, which is your ambient pass. This you can ignore, which is your secondary pass or your additive pass for the lighting. You don't have to mess with that. You just have to say blend mode needs to be based off of these properties right here. So right now, that's pretty much all you need to do. If you don't put in a shader, it's just gonna assume that you have these 4 properties, and that these properties affect these 2 lines. If you have that in your shader, it will just work. All right, so if there are any questions, you can either leave a comment on the video or just send it through the asset store. That would all be fine. I also left a README explaining again the ideal settings, or what I would consider the ideal settings for any of these 5 setups. And yeah, I hope this just makes the process of creating your game a little bit faster, a little bit easier. And if there's anything I can do to make this more universal, because that's what I want from my assets, I don't want them to be very specific, like only on standard materials, that kind of thing. If there's any ideas you have to make this more universal, or situations where it doesn't work, please let me know and I will see what I can do for you.